Welcome to Guilty Pleasure Stories channel that we hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. I've always loved the way our small town comes alive before Christmas. The streets shimmer with lights, the smell of pine lingers in the air, and the crisp snow underfoot makes everything feel like a scene from a snow globe. But this year the season felt heavier, quieter, a weight I couldn't quite explain. It was mid-December when I heard the knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the sight of him on my porch, a confident smile playing on his L*****s took me by surprise. "Mom," he said, warmly stepping inside before I could even process the moment I'm back. Liam, my son, not by blood, but in every way that mattered. I had adopted him when he was just 7, a small boy with haunted eyes and a past too heavy for someone so young. Raising him had been a journey of patience and love, a slow building of trust. At 20 he was no longer that frail boy, but a man now tall, strong and impossibly mature. He had been away at university for 3 years, visiting briefly during the summers, but this was different. He carried an air of resolution, as though returning wasn't just a holiday visit, but something more intentional. "I didn't expect you home so soon," I said, trying to keep my voice light. His smile softened. "I wanted to surprise you. Besides, I owe you." "Don't." I frowned, confused. "Owe me for everything," he replied simply. We settled into the living room, where the warm glow of the fireplace cast flickering shadows on the walls. I asked about school, his friends, his plans. He answered easily, but I sensed something deeper in his tone, a weight beneath the casual words. When he reached for my hand, it startled me. "I wouldn't be here without you, you know," he said. "You gave me everything when I had nothing. I don't know if I ever thanked you properly for that." I laughed, though it came out shaky. "You don't have to thank me for being your mom." His hand lingered on mine, and his gaze was searching, like he was trying to say something he couldn't quite find the words for. Later that evening we decorated the Christmas tree. It had always been our tradition even before he left for college. As we hung the ornaments, old memories surfaced. His first Christmas with me, when he had shyly handed me a handmade card with a shaky "I love you" Mom scrawled inside. "Do you remember this one?" I asked, holding up a little angel figurine he had painted years ago. He chuckled, shaking his head barely, "But I remember how hard you worked to make me feel like I belonged." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken sentiment. "You did belong," I said softly. "You always did." By the time we finished, the tree sparkled with lights and memories. He stood beside me, closer than necessary, and I felt his presence in a way I hadn't before. There was something different about the way he looked at me now, like he saw me not just as his mother, but as a person in my own right. It was unnerving, though not unwelcome, as the days before Christmas passed. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his visit than he was letting on. He lingered in my space, helping me bake cookies, fix the old banister, or run errands. Each time he reached for something, his hand would brush mine, and each time I felt the same inexplicable spark. Then one evening, as we sat by the fire sipping cocoa, he finally said it. "I came back to be here for you." He began, his voice steady but quiet, "Not just for Christmas, but because I want to be the one to take care of you." "Now you don't have to take care of me," I replied quickly, but the words felt hollow. He shook his head. "That's not what I mean. It's not about duty or repayment. It's about how I feel." The weight of his words settled in my chest, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. His hand found mine again, and this time I didn't pull away. "Liam," I started, my voice trembling. "We've always been close," but I know he interrupted, his expression earnest. "And I know this is unconventional, but I've had years to think about it, and I can't pretend I don't feel this way." Silence fell between us, broken only by the crackling of the fire. The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with emotions. I wasn't sure how to process. He was my son legally, emotionally, but the bond we shared had grown into something neither of us could ignore. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my heart aching with confusion and something I dared not name. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "I just needed you to know." As Christmas drew closer, the tension between us ebbed and flowed, in unspoken understanding, lingering in every glance, every touch. I didn't have answers, not then, not yet. But in the quiet moments of that holiday season, I realized that some connections defy explanation, and maybe, just maybe, that was okay. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a blur of quiet moments and unspoken tension. Liam's presence filled the house in a way that was hard to ignore. He seemed to find excuses to be near me, helping with chores, lingering at the kitchen table while I cooked, or sitting with me by the fire after dinner. His proximity was both comforting and disconcerting, stirring feelings I couldn't quite name. It was late one evening, a few days before Christmas, when everything seemed to shift again. We had finished wrapping gifts and were sitting on the couch, the room lit only by the soft glow of the Christmas tree. I had been busy all day and leaned back exhausted, closing my eyes for just a moment. When I opened them, Liam was watching me, his gaze steady and filled with something I couldn't quite read. "You work too hard," he said, his voice low. I laughed softly. "Someone has to make Christmas happen." "You've done enough," he replied, shifting closer. "Let me take care of you for once." Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. The gesture was gentle, almost reverent, and it sent a shiver through me. My heart raced, but I stayed still, unable or unwilling to break the moment. "Liam," I began, my voice catching. "I know this is unusual," he said, his tone earnest, "but I can't pretend anymore. You mean more to me than anyone ever has, and it's not just because you raised me. You're everything." His words hit me like a wave, knocking the air from my lungs. I searched his face looking for hesitation or doubt, but there was none. He truly meant what he was saying. "I don't know if this is right," I whispered. He took my hand, his touch warm and grounding. "It doesn't feel wrong to me," he said softly. "It feels like the most natural thing in the world." The room was silent except for the faint hum of Christmas music playing on the stereo. My mind raced with 900 reasons to stop this, to draw a line and keep us in our respective roles. But my heart whispered something else entirely. "You're not that little boy anymore." I said more to myself than to him. "No," he replied, his gaze steady. "I'm a man now, and I know what I want." For a long moment we sat there, the weight of his words settling over us, and then, as if drawn by some invisible force, I leaned closer. He met me halfway, his forehead resting lightly against mine, and the world seemed to pause. "I've loved you my whole life," he murmured. "I don't know when it changed, but it did, and I think you feel it too." My eyes closed as his words sank in stirring feelings I had been trying to ignore for days, maybe longer. He was right. I felt it too, but the enormity of what we were stepping into was overwhelming. "I don't know how this could work," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," he said, his hand tightening around mine. "Let's just take it one step at a time." His L*****s brushed against my forehead, a soft, tentative gesture that left me breathless. For the first time in days, I didn't pull away. Instead, I allowed myself to lean into the moment, the warmth of his presence, enveloping me like a cocoon. The following days were a delicate dance between old habits and this new, unspoken closeness. We still prepared meals together and watched Christmas movies in the evenings, but there was a new tenderness in our interactions. He touched my shoulder as he passed me in the kitchen, his fingers lingering just a little longer than necessary. I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. His eyes filled with quiet longing, and every time he smiled, I felt my resolve weaken just a little more. On Christmas Eve, we attended the town's candlelight service, a tradition we had kept since he was a boy. The church was packed with families, the warm glow of candlelight casting a golden hue over the room. As we sang Silent Night, I felt his hand brush against mine, and when I looked at him, his expression was soft, almost vulnerable. Without thinking, I slipped my hand into his, and he gave it a gentle squeeze. That night, as we sat by the fire, he handed me a small wrapped package. "Merry Christmas," he said, his voice low. I opened it carefully, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm in the shape of a heart. My breath caught. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice trembling. He smiled. "It reminded me of you, strong, simple, and full of love." I didn't know what to say. Instead, I leaned forward and hugged him, my heart pounding as his arms wrapped around me. We stayed like that for a long time, the fire crackling softly in the background. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events of the evening. In my mind, his words, his touch, the way he had looked at me, all of it felt impossibly right and impossibly complicated. I knew we couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Decisions would have to be made, boundaries set or broken. But for now I let myself drift to sleep with the memory of his warmth and the hope that somehow we would find our way through this together. Christmas morning arrived quietly, the first rays of dawn spilling through the frost-lined windows. The house was silent except for the soft series of the floorboards as I moved through the kitchen, brewing coffee and setting out pastries for breakfast. I wanted everything to feel normal to keep the day light and festive, but nothing felt normal anymore, not with the lingering tension between Liam and me, an undercurrent of something new and profound that neither of us could name aloud. I heard him before I saw him, his familiar footsteps padding softly across the hardwood floor. When I turned, he was leaning against the doorway, his hair told from sleep, wearing a sweatshirt that seemed slightly too small, reminding me of his boyhood days. Merry Christmas. He said, his voice husky. Merry Christmas. I replied, smiling softly. He stepped closer, the warmth of his presence enveloping me before he even spoke again. You're up early, he remarked. I wanted to get everything ready, I said, gesturing to the small spread on the counter. It's tradition. He reached past me for a mug, his arm brushing mine, and I felt a spark that sent my pulse racing. His hand lingered near mine for a moment, our fingers almost touching, and when he turned to look at me, his gaze was deep, searching. Thank you, he said quietly, and though the words were simple, they felt weighted, as though he was thanking me for more than the coffee or the pastries. We ate breakfast by the fire, the quiet intimacy of the moment, unlike anything I'd felt before. He handed me a small package, this one wrapped in silver paper. I already opened my gift, I protested, holding up the bracelet from the night before. This one's different, he said, his voice soft but insistent. Curious, I carefully peeled back the paper to reveal an old photograph in a simple wooden frame. It was of us, me and him, taken on the first Christmas we'd spent together as mother and son. He had been so small then, his face hesitant but hopeful, clinging to me with a quiet desperation that had broken my heart. I remembered that day vividly, the way he had finally smiled when he opened the toy train set. I had saved up for the way he'd hugged me, so tightly I thought I might never breathe again. I stared at the photo, my throat tightening. Where did you find this? I asked, my voice trembling. I've had it with me. At school, he admitted, a shy smile touching his L***s. It reminds me of what matters most. My chest ached, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. Then he reached across the table, his hand closing over mine. You've always been everything to me, he said softly. More than you realize. The day passed in a haze of shared glances and lingering touches. After lunch, we bundled up and went for a walk in the woods behind the house, where the trees stood heavy with snow and the world felt hushed as though it belonged to us alone. We walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath our boots. It's beautiful out here, I said, breaking the quiet. It is. He agreed, though when I turned to look at him, I realized he wasn't looking at the trees or the snow. He was looking at me. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, and I turned away, my breath visible in the crisp air. You're staring, I said lightly, trying to diffuse the tension. I can't help it, he replied simply. We stopped at a clearing where a small bench overlooked the frozen lake. He sat down, tugging me gently to sit beside him. The world felt still, the air heavy with unspoken words. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, he said suddenly, his voice low. But I can't keep pretending that I don't feel this way. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. Liam. This is complicated, I know, he said quickly, but that doesn't make it any less real. I've been trying to push it away, to ignore it, but I can't. You're the most important person in my life. You always have been, and I think you feel it too. The truth of his words struck me like a jolt. I couldn't deny it anymore, not to myself and certainly not to him. The closeness between us, the way he made me feel it, defied logic, but it was undeniable. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to do anything right now, he said, his hand covering mine. Just let me be here for you. Let me show you how much you mean to me. That evening the house felt different, warmer, somehow, as though the snow outside couldn't touch the bubble we had created within these walls.
His voice cracked a mix of desperation and disbelief. She stopped, her hand resting on the door handle. Part of her wanted to keep walking, to leave him there, broken and defeated, but something inside her told her to turn around. So she did. When she faced him, she saw a man who had once been larger than life, reduced to a shadow of his former self, the arrogance, the confidence. It was all gone. In its place was a man who had just lost everything, and for the first time perhaps realized what he had done.
Bethany.
Please wait, he said, taking a step toward her. I didn't know. I never meant for things to be this way. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. You never meant for what exactly? To abandon us, to leave us with nothing, or to live your life as if we never existed. Michael's face twisted in pain, his carefully composed mask cracking. I was wrong, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought that by cutting ties, I could protect myself. Keep control. Thought I was doing the right thing. Bethany's eyes flashed with anger. The right thing? You left us with nothing. My mother worked herself to the bone, just to keep us alive. While you lived in luxury, you never even checked on us. Michael looked down, his hands trembling slightly. I thought you'd be better off without me. I made mistakes, Bethany, but I never imagined you'd rise like this. I'm proud of you.
Proud.
Bethany's voice was sharp. You don't get to be proud of me, not after what you did. The words cut deep, and Michael winced as if he had been physically struck. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with years of unresolved pain and anger. I've spent so many nights wondering what I would say if I ever saw you again. Bethany said, her voice softer now, though still filled with emotion. But now that I'm standing here, I realize I don't need to say anything more. I've already won. Michael's face paled even further. I know I can't undo the past, but please, Bethany, don't shut me out completely. I want to make things right, can help you, support you. We can rebuild what was lost. Bethany narrowed her eyes. Rebuild? There's nothing to rebuild, Michael. You were never there for me or for Mom. And now you want to sweep in and act like you can fix it with money and power.
Well,
I don't need you, and I never did. Tears welled up in Michael's eyes, the weight of his failures crashing down on him in a way that no financial loss could ever match. He reached out toward her, but she took a step back. You may be the great Michael Simmons, Bethany said, her voice steady and calm, but you're not my father. You forfeited that right the day you walked away. You're just a man who thought money could solve everything. But I've learned that the most valuable things in life aren't bought. They're earned. Michael's outstretched hand slowly fell to his side, his body sagging as though the last of his strength had left him. He had spent years building empires, acquiring wealth, and controlling the narrative of his life. But tonight, he had lost the one thing he couldn't control: his family. I'm sorry, he whispered. Barely audible over the buzz of the crowd around them, Bethany gave him one last look, a mixture of pity and resolve in her eyes. I hope you find peace, Michael, but you won't find it in me. With that, she turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving Michael standing alone, surrounded by people, yet utterly isolated. The once mighty businessman had been reduced to a man who had lost everything that truly mattered. Outside, the cool night air greeted Bethany as she stepped onto the street. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure wash over her. The confrontation had been years in the making, and now that it was done, she felt lighter, as though a burden she had carried for so long had finally been lifted. As she walked toward her car, she thought of her mother. Freya had always been the strong one, the one who taught Bethany to survive, to thrive. Despite the odds, Bethany smiled to herself, knowing that Freya would be proud of her tonight. She had faced her past, confronted the man who had tried to erase them, and she had emerged victorious, not just in business, but in life. The road ahead was hers to walk free of the shadows of her father's abandonment. As Bethany drove away from the glittering lights of the ballroom, she didn't look back. She had no reason to. Her future was bright, and she was ready to embrace it fully. The next morning, the headlines were plastered with a story of the event.
Daughter
reclaims fortune from absent father. A legacy restored. The media buzzed with the dramatic twist of Bethany Simmons' rise and Michael's fall, the story of a daughter who had built her own empire only to take down the very man who had forsaken her captivated the public's imagination. But for Bethany, the headlines didn't matter. What mattered was that she had won not just against Michael, but against the version of herself that had once felt abandoned. Unloved and powerless, she had reclaimed her power, her legacy, and most importantly, her sense of self-worth, and no one, especially not Michael Simmons, could ever take that away from her again. My story ends here. If you feel that this story is meaningful and brings useful lessons, please like and subscribe to the channel to support me. Thanks for listening and see you in the next videos.